Hi, everyone. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane.
Welcome to the musical Innertube, the podcast born out of a mistake.
We once meant to introduce a soothing musical interlude, but we said soothing musical Innertube, and the name stuck.
On this podcast, we talk to interesting people about their interesting lives, jobs, hobbies, and passions.
Difference makers who really make a difference. Almost 60 years ago, on February 18th, 1965, African-American essayist, memoirist, and novelist James Baldwin and conservative thought leader and writer William F. Buckley had their now famous televised debate at the Union Society at Cambridge University in England. At issue was the assertion that, quote, the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro, close quote. Shown on BBC and later on U.S. television, that debate is both a product of its time and a forecast of much that we have been through ever since. Our guest today on the musical Innertube is Nicholas Buccola, professor of government in the Department of Government at Claremont McKenna College in Claremont, California. He's here today to discuss his 2019 book, The Fire is Upon Us, James Baldwin, William F. Buckley Jr., and the debate over race in America. Welcome, Nick Buccola.
Thanks, John. I'm so happy to be here.
We're happy you're here. Maybe we should start as you do in the book and get some background on these two outstanding 20th century figures. When you wrote the book, did you discover anything surprising about either James Baldwin or William F. Buckley?
Yeah, I mean, originally I had the idea of writing a shorter book that was really focused on the night itself, this dramatic night in February 1965. And then once I got into the archive, I realized like there's a much longer story to be told. And so, yeah, there was a lot of surprise along the way. I started out in the Buckley archive, which is vast at Yale. And, I think the most surprising thing to me was just like really getting into the behind the scenes Buckley writing memos back and forth with editors of the magazine, how they're really thinking through not just what they think, but how they're going to present what they think to the world. And so I'm sure we'll get into some of that. And then Baldwin's archive opened, kind of after I started writing the book, which was, a blessing and a curse. I'd already, written a bit, but now I had to go back and revise. When Baldwin's archive opened in 2017 at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem. Baldwin, I think there was a lot of, surprising things in there. One of the most surprising things for the purposes of the book was that Baldwin actually had in his archive, which is far less vast than Buckley's, a lot of material related to the debate. He kept the handwritten notes that he wrote on, hotel stationery that he had on the lectern during the debate. There was all this correspondence between his agent and the publicists who were, putting the debate together. It was just a really interesting process to kind of reconstruct how the debate came to happen. And then, of course, the debate itself was such an important and dramatic moment in the history of the world.
I mean, it's almost a book within a book in a way, in that when you hit, it's not that I was flipping ahead, I wasn't, but when my dad and I actually watched it when it first came out in 65, I was only 13, so I'm not sure that I got all of it, but I got enough of it, and I was excited to be seeing something that came all the way from England. That's how it was. Different things were in those days, but I will say that there's this sense of tension and anticipation in your book. Suddenly, when you hit the debate itself, I mean, I think you're really getting your game gloves on, and it's you have that sense that, oh, here we are.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things about the way I start the book, right, with walking into the debating hall and the tension of that night and all the the drama of the moment, the high tide of the civil rights movement, these two intellectual giants, kind of set to square off in a sort of prize fight of ideas, right? And they're really not just significant as writers and individuals, but also, they really are embodiments of movements. And so to have them on this international stage together, the television cameras going, the world is watching. So that aspect of it, I think, was really compelling to me as I was doing the research, but also, just this sense that these two individuals, the lives that they led, the worldviews that they came to have, like they were really capturing such important strands of American history. And to have them there that night, in that moment was was really remarkable. And it sort of gave me, otherwise writing a book about Baldwin and Buckley wouldn't have necessarily been, made much sense, but it gave me this excuse to think about these two human beings together. And then to, trace their story through history, and then also interact with a lot of people along the way, both in the research and then in presenting the book to the public, who actually, either witnessed it or watched it on television. And they had memories, varied across the board of memories of what that was like for them. In some cases, sort of like it's a very difficult thing for folks to remember, in terms of what it made them feel to watch Baldwin in that space that night. So it's a really powerful story that I think reached so many people through the years and still does.
And Nick, this is, I want to say, the perfect matchup for this debate between these two, because in the early part of your book, you do trace their backgrounds from birth up until pretty much the time when they meet for the debate. And Buckley was born into white privilege in New England, and Baldwin came up from Harlem. So in some sense, their whole lives were almost crafted to meet at this hall at this time with their backgrounds, what they could bring to that discussion. It just seemed like it was a perfect setup.
Yeah, Don, that's true. I mean, I always say that history is the greatest dramatist, right? You couldn't make this up, right? These two guys, born to such radically different circumstances. What they have in common from a very young age is this obsession with language and this obsession with the power of words to change the world. And so you watch them as they come out of these, radically different backgrounds. Buckley is, as you said, is not only a son of privilege, but he's really, trained from a young age by his parents to be a defender of that privilege and to defend that privilege with language and debate and writing. And Baldwin, on the other hand, is coming, through the experience of essentially trying to figure out, how can I escape the situation in which I find myself? How can I avoid the despair that I see consuming my father? And
yes,
and how can I find it? And he also, he uses language as his mechanism, both as a writer and as a preacher. So to have these two individuals, coming through time, as John said earlier, I mean, the sort of tension that builds up in the book is you start out, in the debating hall, and then you have to wait another 200 pages to get back to the debating hall. But that you can just sort of see these two individuals on this collision course. The fact that they actually ended up coming into that space together is, a result of a series of accidents, really. But there's a sense in which they were on this collision course all the while.
But also, it was an interesting thing to learn. And since I've been reading lately about the roots of white supremacy and how much of a part the Daughters of the American Confederacy played in that the women were the ones that put out the idea that it wasn't really about slavery, it was about states' rights, and started the history of the Civil War in that direction. And then to learn that Buckley's mom was from the South and probably more than anybody else responsible for helping him in his ideas of what white people meant to the development of America. That just kind of set me off a little bit because that's roots coming out in William F. Buckley Jr.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things about about this story is that to do this kind of deep dive into the life of William F. Buckley and to kind of think in slow motion with him and really try to understand how he came to view the world in the way he did and why he did what he did. And I tried, to the extent I could to be, as fair to him, let him speak for himself, but really to understand, like in the case of his household, which is a pretty peculiar household, in terms of the in-home tutors and the vast estate and all that. But just, I think everyone can relate to all the ways in which we are socialized by our upbringing. We're socialized by our parents and the way we're educated and all these different things. And Buckley really was, taught by his mother a particular worldview when it came to race that he ends up defending, throughout a lot of his life, certainly in the period that he's engaging with Baldwin. And I say to in the book that, Buckley is surrounded by Southern intellectuals in the 50s and 60s who really are just putting in more sophisticated terms everything that his mother ever taught him about race, and he's also, and he's taught, from a very young age, this deeply from his father as well, this very anti-democratic, elitist way of thinking that like we Buckleys are part of this elite group. They even called, the remnant was this idea they got from this family friend, Albert J. Nock. It's an elite group of people who are really best suited to guide the society, to preserve civilization. So that was, Buckley from a very young age is being told, you are in this elect group and you have a job to do. And your job is to defend, what we value against all who threaten. And Baldwin, from the first time Buckley, lays eyes on Baldwin's words on the page, he identifies him as somebody he's going to need to, defend his fortress from Baldwin.
So we get to the debate. We have really two very different self-presentation styles. We have two very different personal styles of using language. On the one hand, we have Baldwin, who offers this elliptical, nuanced, very, I think, very advanced sort of argumentation. On the other hand, I have a feeling that Buckley wasn't 100% prepared for that. But you say, and I'd like you to open this up a little bit, that Buckley was not actually interested in reasoning. He wasn't a great reasoner. That was not part of his rhetoric. And what do you mean when you say that?
Yeah, I mean, the styles of the two at the debate are really important. And I think thinking about the ways in which the style of speaking, the style, the approaches that they take are really, they're related to the substance of what they have to say.
This is it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that there's something about, in terms of Buckley's style, like Buckley had always been from, I say in the book that, he may have been, training for formal debate back into when he was in diapers. He sort of always, at the dinner table, they're having these discussions. It's a family that really cares deeply about ideas, about the presentation of ideas. Buckley, among the 10 kids, is the sort of star from a young age at being able to do this. And so he goes into that debating hall. Really, it's his playground. He's ready for this. He's been a formal debater, through the years, at Yale, prep school at Yale, and then he, eventually, out in the world. And so just all the way through, from the earliest days. And so he goes in there with a sense of, in these settings, it's a combination of performance and seriousness. You want to try to, make the audience laugh a little. You want, you can be a little bit more, there's a little bit of ad hominem attack that seems to be kind of part of the norms, and so, yeah, he goes in there, essentially, he says during Buckley speaks after Baldwin, but Buckley says during Baldwin's speech, I got a sense that I was not in a friendly space. Baldwin gets a standing ovation. And Buckley says, I knew it wasn't going to be my night. And so he says that, I had a choice. Do I try to win a few more votes, or do I just really stick to my guns? And of course, he chose the latter, and he loses by this huge margin. But he says he's very proud of his performance because the way he puts it later is, I didn't give them one goddamn inch, is the source of his pride. So, yeah, I mean, it's a very, I would say that even Buckley's most, staunch defenders will admit it wasn't his best night as a debater. He gives a long, meandering speech. It's actually the recording that folks can watch on YouTube is an edited version of Buckley's speech. He actually spoke for 29 minutes. He gets some questions from the students during the course of his remarks, but he goes in a lot of different directions, that we can explore. But he tries to attack Baldwin as a dangerous radical who has essentially been lying to the audience throughout his speech, and that, really what we need to do is hunker down and defend Western civilization from people like Baldwin who are intent on overthrowing it. And so it's, Buckley's speech is a meandering one, and Baldwin's, I think, as you said, is a very different story.
We were talking about Baldwin's roots, at least his rhetorical roots, being in the pulpit, that he grew up hearing his dad. He grew up hearing preachers. And this is hard to talk about. I mean, I try to write poetry. I'm sort of part of the poetry scene in Philly. To me, it makes sense to say that a person's rhythms are part of what they're saying, In other words, form is content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If we were to say the words that Baldwin says in a flat tone of voice like this, it's more than not having rhythm. It's that you're not actually saying the same things with the same force in the same way. And then so in a way, Buckley is different. I noticed that he knows the one thing he can't do is attack him directly or very violently or raise his voice. That's not going to work. It's going to actually hurt. So as you say, he decides, all right, I'm just going to stick to my battlements and, devil take the hindmost. My question to you is, most people have never heard the whole Buckley speech. What do you think of the way that the BBC edited him? Did they cut out things you wish had been part of it? Did you think that it was a fair edit? Because I don't think he gets as much time as Baldwin does in the BBC show. Not much. So I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I think the editor was confronted with the difficult task, because, I think Buckley, they made the choice there's the two student speeches prior to Baldwin and Buckley getting up there, one student on each side, and they edited those down as well. And I think, they wanted to include the students, which I think is good. It was a student debating society. But then that left them with, Baldwin was closer to meeting the time limit they'd imposed than Buckley was. But yeah, I think, there's elements of Buckley's speech that I think I wish were, part of what people saw, not because I think they were more persuasive or anything like that, but more that it sort of, I think, further, captures, it just deepens the sense of what he was up to. I mean, there's a line, for example, when he says to the students, and again, this is one of the things I failed to note before, is that, part of this being Buckley's playground, when he walks in there, is that, Buckley is surrounded by he's surrounded by a mostly white crowd, and overwhelmingly, this is an elite crowd, right? This is the training ground for British elites. And I think there's part of his expectation when he goes into the room that he thinks it's actually a fairly conservative place in terms of British domestic politics at the time.
Sure it is.
Yeah. So he's kind of thinks like, I don't think he goes in there thinking this is going to be, I'm going to get the vote's going to be totally lopsided. But I think that part of what, so part of what he does when he walks in is he's sort of thinking we, the students and I should be together against him, Baldwin. Like, he's not part of us. And so when he says to them, like, Baldwin is a threat to the faith of our fathers, right? Our fathers. He's talking to those students in a way. And he says, one of the lines that's cut out of the recording is that he says, Baldwin wants you to go raid the libraries around here and burn the books. He wants you to get rid of the Plato and the Aristotle and the Bible and so on. And it's this thing that runs through Buckley's critique of Baldwin, that he's this dangerous revolutionary, hell-bent on overthrowing, nothing less than, Western civilization. And Buckley is, he thinks he's going to be able to convince this audience of this. I think that what he says to the students at one point, a student says to him, this is another thing cut out of the recording. A student stands up to ask a question. Buckley acknowledges him. And the student says, can you point to any line in Baldwin's writings that indicates that he believes what you're saying? And Buckley, and Buckley,
fair question.
Yeah, fair question. And Buckley, Buckley basically turns it, and Buckley was very clever at, of course, coming back, from any question. He's good at deflating and misdirecting. And he basically says, well, he essentially accuses the student of not having read any of Baldwin's writings. And he says, I'm not familiar enough with your rules to know if I should have been forbidden from reading Baldwin before I got here. But and I would say one of the substantive lines that does end up in the recording that I think is Buckley trying to offer a substantive response to this question is there's a line in Down to the Cross, the long essay that makes up most of the book, The Fire Next Time, that, Buckley, I'm not sure. One of the questions I get a lot is, did Buckley actually read Baldwin, or did he just read, reviews of Baldwin? But one of the lines that really bothered Buckley was a line in which Baldwin says, the only thing that white people have that black people should want is power. And Buckley was deeply offended by that idea because what he thought it indicated was that Baldwin didn't appreciate this idea that Buckley thought of himself as a guardian of quote unquote civilization, right? The Cambridge students and I, Buckley was thinking, we are the creators of quote unquote civilization. And Baldwin, in order to be included in our political and economic life fully, one needs to be quote unquote civilized. So that was something that Buckley, again and again, in both international and domestic politics, that was at the core of his understanding of white supremacy and his defense of white supremacy. And so the part of that, I mean, just one more thing I'll say about that is Baldwin is, there to say, and he says if Buckley had read him seriously, he would know this. Baldwin is, in many ways, much more deeply committed to thinking seriously about this idea of Western civilization than I think Buckley ever was. I mean, Baldwin is somebody, Baldwin knew his Bible backwards and forwards.
Hello.
He had, and he knew, he had just published an essay the year before that Buckley probably didn't read. Baldwin wrote called Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare, which is basically about how he learned, sort of his engagement with Shakespeare over the years and how he sort of came to see that Shakespeare could be, for him, not somebody who was an architect of his oppression, but as somebody who he could use, in his quest for liberation. So yeah, I mean, that's a lot, but I think part of what I think in many ways, the debate is a story of two people who, but Buckley refused, Baldwin says this about Buckley later, Buckley refused to listen, right? That he says that is one of his central accusations of Buckley is, I wish he would have just listened. If he listened to me, then maybe we could have had a conversation, but because he was unwilling to listen to me, a conversation was really not possible.
We'll return to our podcast in just a moment, but first, here's a soothing musical interlude.
Nicholas Buccola is a professor of government in the Department of Government at Claremont McKenna College in Claremont, California.
For the past decade and more, Nick has published books about great figures in American history and how their lives and thinking helped shape our democracy.
He has written or edited 2 books about Frederick Douglass, The Political Thought of Frederick Douglass in 2012, and The Essential Douglass, Selected Writings and Speeches of 2016.
And his book, Abraham Lincoln and Liberal Democracy, appeared in 2016.
His biggest bestseller, The Fire Is Upon Us, James Baldwin, William F. Buckley Jr., and the Debate Over Race in America, was published by Princeton University Press in 2019. It won the Oregon Book Prize and was nominated for many more awards.
For more about Nick, see his homepage at cmc.edu/academic/faculty/profile/Nicholas, Nicholas-Buccola, Buccola.
And now we return you to the musical Innertube, already in progress. Nick, I have a copy of your book here, right in front of me.
Excellent.
I want to read, you talk about Baldwin delivering his speech much like a preacher. And John had mentioned that earlier, that it was tough for Buckley to come back against somebody who was speaking so forcefully from the pulpit, more or less.
Yeah. And
I want to read something that you have quoted from Baldwin's speech here, where he says to the audience, and this is a quote from Baldwin, "It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover the flag to which you have pledged allegiance has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians, while you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover the country which your birthplace and to which you owe your life and your identity has not, in its whole system of reality, involved any place for you." And I think that's what you get to in the heart of Baldwin's winning the debate, is that he was very visceral, because you do quote a Cambridge undergraduate, Charles Davies, as saying, Baldwin moved beyond rational argument to something more visceral. And that was probably what won the day, is that whereas Buckley had his ideas and his framework of debate, which he had excelled in for years, Baldwin got up and told a story about his life and about how it fit in Western civilization and how that wasn't all very pretty at all.
I think that those two things are, really intimately related to each other, right? So Baldwin gets up there, and this is something, he had been a young minister in Harlem storefront churches and left the church, but remained forever a preacher, right? So he gets up there and announces, "I'm here tonight as a kind of Jeremiah, right? I'm here to deliver a particular kind of sermon. I'm here to say things that the audience doesn't want to hear." And so it's really a sermon about the perils of white supremacy. And so he goes through then and offers this critique of white supremacy, and the impact it has on two categories that he uses in the speech, that what he calls the subjugated and the subjugators, like the targets of white supremacy, where, there's a millions of details of every day that communicate to some people that their lives do not matter as much, that they are, there's going to be a million different ways in which people are going to learn that the flag to which they're pledging allegiance has not pledged allegiance to them, as you just noted that line. And Baldwin also has this part of the speech where he talks about the impact of white supremacy on the subjugators, the people who are supposed to be benefiting from it. And he uses this example of Sheriff Jim Clark, who's, at that point on televisions everywhere, newspapers, people are seeing him brandishing his cattle prod against men, women, and children in Alabama. And Baldwin says, when you see Jim Clark, using his cattle prod, what's happening to his victim is ghastly, but in some ways, what's happening inside of Clark is much, much worse. And he talks about the moral life, is the phrase he uses. The moral life of Jim Clark has been destroyed by this plague called color. And so he basically says, like, this doctrine is something that, for Clark, his entire sense of value in the world, his sense of what he ought to do in the world, is attached to this delusion that the color of his skin makes him superior to other people. And Baldwin says, what could be more destructive of one's soul than something like that? Something so, so cheap, right? So unmeaningful, right? But Clark has been robbed of living a meaningful moral life by this doctrine. So yeah, I mean, that's Baldwin's approach that night, is to deliver this sermon in this space, overwhelmingly white space. He says to the audience, the doctrine of white supremacy came from over here. We got it from you guys. Yeah. And so, he's there to say things that are going to make the audience uncomfortable. But just one last point about the sort of visceral aspect of it. Christy Davies, remarkable Cambridge student who I interviewed, one of my first interviews, he was the key figure. And once I tracked down Christy, he helped me find everybody else. And Christy was an academic in the UK. And unfortunately, he passed away before the book came out, but he was so important. And Christy was this remarkable figure in history who actually participated. So in 1964, Malcolm X came over to debate at the Oxford Union. And Cambridge and Oxford had this exchange thing where the high officers in each union would be invited to do a guest debate at the other one. So Christy Davies participated in the Malcolm X Oxford debate and then was witness to the Baldwin Buckley debate. But yeah, Christie's point about the rationality versus the kind of visceral nature, he makes a big deal about the moment in the debate when Baldwin says, "I picked the cotton, I built the railroad." And I think Christie's onto something really important there. And I was actually just talking about this with my students this week, is when we think about the most profound moments of revelation in our lives, like these moments where we feel like we've learned something truly meaningful, how much of those moments do we explain by way of reason, and how much do we explain by way of something else? And I think there's something about that Buckley came in, and Buckley was, definitely could manipulate emotions and so on. And I don't think, I'm not saying Baldwin was trying to manipulate. I think Baldwin was there, to go back to how these two approached that night. Baldwin was there to tell the truth. Buckley, I think was there to do something else, or at least he was there to tell a very different kind of truth. And so I think that's a really important way to, at least for me, to make sense of what happened there that night, is the way what are the objectives of these two individuals in this space? What are they really trying to do?
It seems to me that there's a word we use today that wasn't used very much in 1965, which is paternalism. And Buckley would say, well, you can call me a paternalist, but that's fine. I'm going to embrace it because who else is going to run this place? To Buckley, the assumption is that his caste not only run things, but must run things, not only have the right, but have the obligation. And then you have Baldwin on the other side, who is saying, well, I've come here partly out of sympathy and concern for those who think they run things because it's all about to blow up. And we have to see how deeply sick and endangered democracy is and look at how it's endangered. So there's this sense that for Buckley, safety lies in his caste ruling things. For Baldwin, there is no safety.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great point, John. It's a really important, contrast, between the two of these two figures is that Buckley, as you say, is an unapologetic paternalist, and from a very young age, again, he's taught to sort of embrace this role. We Buckleys are elites. We have that sort of status imposes on us an obligation to take care of those beneath us. And Buckley was so committed to that. And it was something that he was, in all these different areas of political life, he would defend that view. During the Cambridge debate, right, there's this moment, the audience thinks he's kidding. They laugh when he says that the solution to what's happening in Mississippi is not to provide the solution is not to provide Black people the right to vote. It's to disenfranchise 65% of the white people currently voting. And the audience laughs like, oh, he can't be serious. It's 1965. Who says that? He was totally serious. I mean, he had been defending that view for so long. And so Baldwin, essentially, I think, Baldwin is somebody who is difficult to label in terms of ideology and politics and that sort of thing. But I think one of the really deep, important contrasts that your question raises is Baldwin is a radically democratic thinker. And I mean democracy in not as a system of government as much as I mean it as an ethos. Something my friend Melvin Rogers writes so beautifully about democracy as an ethos. Baldwin was really devoted to the idea of reimagining our very identities in a way that treats our fellows as, equals in dignity and worthy of our respect. And so at the end of the speech, there's this beautifully radically democratic line when Baldwin says, and he's saying this to Buckley, among others, he says, we have an obligation now to forge a new identity together, right? That is what we're doing. So Buckley is always thinking of himself as apart, from Baldwin and what Baldwin represents. And that part of what he's trying to do is manage this from this paternalistic point of view. And Baldwin is there to say, no, that's not how this is going to work. When Baldwin is saying freedom now, Buckley is saying some freedom one day when we decide you're ready. Baldwin says, no, it's not we and you, it's us together. And we have a responsibility to do this together. And so I think that's the radically democratic critique that Baldwin offers of somebody like Buckley. And Buckley, again, was just, you could not have come up with, we could not have imagined a more fitting, sort of person for Baldwin to engage on this level, because Buckley was, for all his peculiarities, he was so deeply committed to this idea of paternalism, and he brings that to the stage that night.
So following the publication of this book and the interviews that you've had with people since it's come out, what sense do you get of the fact that all this was said in 1965, and today it could be said with equal importance? In other words, things haven't changed all that much. We still have paternalistic white rule, and we still have Black and other colored people saying we want in and not really being able to get in. Why did Buckley's view of the world stick and Baldwin's is still trying to get in?
Yeah, that's one thing about this debate, it's sadly relevant, right? I mean, in some ways, when I talk to audiences about the debate, or I'm, you're working with students. There's a way in which, the students hear what's being said and audiences hear what's being said, and they ask this question, like, what has changed? Not what has changed. I mean, obviously a lot has changed, but what has changed on the level that Baldwin's really concerned with, which he would call, he would use like terms like spiritual, the level of the soul, the sort of level, there's all the things we can, quote in terms of economic progress and this economic change and sociological change and political change. There's all sorts of ways in which, we still have, huge disparities in our society, of course. and Baldwin would always be there to say all those disparities, right? Underneath all of that is really something that's ailing our souls, right? And I think, just this morning, I open my email, I get all sorts of, emails from across the political spectrum, newsletters. And just this morning, I got, something in my email that was essentially, a Buckley argument about race right today, February 2nd, 2024. An intellectual making very, very similar arguments, racially paternalistic arguments, racially exclusive arguments. And so these arguments are so relevant. They're still, very, very, dominant in a lot of our politics. And so I think there's a kind of way in which the sort of the critique that Baldwin is offering and the alternative that Baldwin is offering is, as relevant as ever, right? I mean, there's something about the fact that I'm getting that email today on February 2nd, 2024, is an indication that what was sort of at the core of what Buckley was doing is at the core of a lot of what's happening on the American right today, because basically what Baldwin was trying to say to us is, look, this isn't about me. He said this a million times. This isn't about me. This is about you. There's something in you that makes it, you need me to occupy, William F. Buckley, you need me to occupy a particular space in your mind. And that is something that has to do with your own failure to achieve a meaningful moral identity, right? So you're relying on status, you're relying on a sense of superiority to other people, whether it has to do with, excluding people on the basis of race, of gender, of, where they're born in the world, all these different ways we exclude people. Baldwin is there to say again and again, we have to peel back the surface. This isn't about whatever's there on the surface. This is about something in you that you think you need this feeling of superiority to find identity in the world. And Baldwin challenges us, all of us, to try to break free of that and to figure out ways to, confront the world, he says, as ourselves. He says that's a reckless idea, to try not to rely on all these ideologies of exclusion, to actually, identify other human beings and treat them with the dignity and respect they deserve, and not rely on the sense of superiority to find meaning in our lives. And so that's the thing about this, that's why I will, as long as I'm kicking, I'm going to be, preaching the gospel of Jimmy Baldwin, because I think it's always going to be relevant. We're always going to be engaged in the struggle of trying to treat each other more humanely. And I think that's why, Baldwin's so important.
Amen. Nick, I don't want you to let the cat out of the bag or anything, but I'm wondering what you're working on these days.
Yeah, I am working. So essentially, as I worked on Baldwin and Buckley, and this debate, again, as we talked about before, gave me this excuse to think about these two figures together. And I found it to be, a really, I found it to be an experience as a writer that felt important and exhilarating. And I loved writing the book. And so but as I worked on it, I felt like I'm looking at the tip, the tips of about various icebergs here. And so I'm a political theorist by background. So I think about, these big questions of, although the book reads much, hopefully like a narrative, I'm really sort of behind it all. I'm sort of smuggling in a lot of big questions of political philosophy, like, what is justice? What is freedom? And so on. So I was really interested in freedom as a sort of central idea in this historical moment in American politics, where you have the civil rights movement, and in that phase of the civil rights movement, marching under the banner of freedom now, and you have the conservative movement, also, freedom is central to their vocabulary, and clearly they didn't always agree on what freedom was. And so I came up with, this idea I'm going to write this book about freedom, and it's going to have all these different characters in it that I'm going to think about, these two movements. I wanted to think about them again together. And I had some, really smart people look at my proposal and say, I think you have at least two books here. There's a lot of people that you're trying to think about. And I was raised Catholic, so I do think in threes. So maybe this is the second in a trilogy. So right now I have a book that's now, I have completed a draft that's out for peer review. Hopefully, I guess would come out, probably in early 2025, I guess would be the earliest it would come out. But yeah, I'm thinking about the concept of freedom by way of these two movements, in particular characters in those movements. And then I'll probably do a third volume that sort of looks at grassroots activists in both movements and tries to get a sense of how they understood, what they took themselves to be doing and how we might interpret it. So I found it really helpful to think about these movements together and try to understand how, people in each movement, kind of view the other. And so, yeah, I'm doing that among other things, but that's kind of the next big book that'll come out.
Well, this has been wonderful. We could go on. We've been talking to Nicholas Buccola about William F. Buckley, James Baldwin, and the future, his own and the American experiment's future. And we wish you the best. We hope you write more books so we can have you back on. And thanks for coming on the Musical Innertube.
Thanks, John and Don. This has been a lot of fun, and I definitely look forward to being back on.
Outstanding.
Thanks, Nick. And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Hey, let us know how we're doing. Send us an email at musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com.
Do you know someone with a great story to tell? Let us know. Send us an email or log in to our website, musicalinnertube.com, and click on the microphone in the lower right-hand corner to leave us a voicemail.
And while you're on our website, take a few minutes to listen to past episodes of the podcast. They're all there, along with pictures and biographies of our guests, blog posts, and lots more.
And as always, our thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for providing us with our theme music.